Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time, we examined the crisis at Hyrule Castle, which is something of a curveball in terms of traditional dungeon expectations, even more so than the 4 temples that preceded it. Today, we're looking at 2 key locations that, when examined together, fit the role of being the game's 6th dungeon. But before we get into that, as usual, I need to offer my obligatory spoiler warning. Major spoiler stuff is ahead, and during the last section of this video, I will be discussing the end of the game. So don't say I didn't warn you. With that out of the way, let's hop into things. The last video was particularly sparse when it came to pre-dungeon objectives. That isn't the case this time. Arguably, this is the dungeon with the longest lead-up questline in the game. There are, of course, multiple ways of doing things, including skipping some sections of the quest entirely, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to be looking at the quest in its entirety and the way the game guides you through these scenarios. But first, a bit of a fumble. After finishing our battle with Phantom Ganon in the castle and returning to Lookout Landing, Purah and the new sages will come to the conclusion that there is likely to be a 5th sage somewhere that needs to be recruited to your cause. Purah then lets you loose into the wild with a hint, based on what we've learned about the
Secret stone?
Secret stone?
Secret stone.
That stone that you are wearing.
Demon King?
Demon King?
Demon King. The imprisoning war.
The sage was, well, it was Minoru. Since Minoru is a Zonai, we're told we need to investigate old Zonai ruins. What Purah means by this is to check the huge, giant ruins that are visible from here, the ring ruins at Kakariko. What I, on my eager first playthrough of the game, did instead was head right to the area on the map called the Zonai Ruins. And what did I find? Literally nothing. This was on me. I didn't read the cues correctly and rushed ahead, but in hindsight, the game does make effort to point you towards Kakariko. So yeah, I spent some time wandering aimlessly in Faron for a bit, then I went to check other notable ruins, including those Kakariko ring ruins. With Puppet Zelda discovered, we can now access these floating ruins, which were off limits before, chat with Toro and Paya and I guess Calip, and then head to the Zonai ruins. From here, we get to conduct this little investigation with Toro, checking all these newly opened sections of the ruins, exploring the old site and piecing together the charged armor set. It is worth mentioning that this area was in Breath of the Wild, but was really just used for a singular shrine quest in that game. That said, it gained something of a reputation over the years among the more hardcore Zelda community, particularly among theorists. The Zonai were at the time this enigmatic tribe that we had only the tiniest slivers of information about. So with that in mind, I am so glad that this area was put to use in the main story. It's fun to comb through here again, essentially in the reverse path of the one that most people likely took in Breath of the Wild, and there are some very cool lore implications here, as these now iconic ruins are revealed to have been quite literally built over top of actual ancient Zonai structures. It's cool stuff. Per the info Toro gives us, offering a charge up here activates some sort of lightning rod mechanism within the dragon statues, which clears up the storm around the Thunderhead Isle. So we're off to investigate there next. Eventually, at the end of the archipelago, we'll find Dragonhead Island, the music for which is just beautiful. It's the track you've been hearing in the background here. Within the island is a familiar door, a twin to the one found in the back room of the Temple of Time. Within this chamber, we'll find Mineru's mask. She'll speak to us and direct the player to follow this beam of light, which takes us down to Tobios Hollow, and then into the dungeon. But before we head inside, a few things I want to note here. The Thunderhead Isles are great. We have a lengthy string of disconnected little sky islands that comprise a semi-linear curated experience. This is the same sort of very good level design that was found during the Rising Chain Islands leading up to the Wind Temple, or the Wellspring Islands leading up to the Water Temple. These sorts of scenarios are when the Sky Island concept really shines through best, though the atmosphere is far more somber here. There's lots of secrets to find, enemies to battle, and goodies to collect while we make our way from island to island. I'd also like to quickly highlight here how well the geometry of these islands lends itself to the use of Ascend. Ascend is such a game changer of an ability when it comes to traversal, and these islands are so often built with it in mind. Whether it be by placing these pillars under the higher islands or having little buildings that they work within, the ability just feels so crucial here in a very Zelda way. The same way that an item like the claw shots felt crucial to areas in prior games designed with that in mind. There's even a shrine in here that is only accessible using that ability. It's good stuff. Thematically, the Great Door at Dragonhead Island makes sense, but also from a game design standpoint, this is important, as the doors act pretty simply as a checkpoint to measure that you've at least progressed through enough of the game, and therefore collected enough hearts to take on the challenges ahead. Really, you just need 10, so the 3 you start with, the 1 you get on the Great Sky Islands, the 5 in the previous main dungeons, and then at least 1 more from either shrines or from the Bargainer, or whatever. They could all be from shrines if you're doing this before you've done the other dungeons. Really, where you get them from is less important than the fact that you have gotten them, since doing either shrines or the main dungeons all act as great ways to teach you the game's core systems, which all get put to use in this upcoming dungeon. So in essence, this door is like those little meter sticks at theme parks. You must be this tall to ride, or in this case, you must have learned at least this much about the game to ride. And yeah, as mentioned before, there are sections of this lead up that are entirely skippable. The Thunderdome around these Sky Islands is meant to be here as a deterrent, a way to keep players out until the right time. However, for some players, it can have the exact opposite effect, piquing their curiosity instead. You can skip all of this stuff in the Zonai Ruins, and if you've got the battery power and enough determination, just head right on in. Nintendo could have programmed a void out zone into the clouds here. They have done that very thing in the past, including in this game. You can't leave the Great Sky Islands until the time is right. In Breath of the Wild, you can't exit the plateau early. Even Skyward Sword had its own Thunderhead to prevent access to certain Sky Islands. But they made a choice here to let you in if you worked for it. I like that. With all of this done and the elevator at Tobios Hollow activated, we can head down into the depths and into the dungeon. The Depths, an expansive underground landscape that stretches across the entire underbelly of Hyrule. On the surface, just east of Dea Village, we'll find a series of rather insignificant foothills. But nearly 700 meters straight down from here hides the Construct Factory, obscured by the pitch blackness that pervades the depths. It is this collection of disconnected buildings that will fill the role of our 6th dungeon. The Construct Factory and Spirit Temple are pretty unlike anything else in the game as far as dungeon design goes, and when looking at it through a critical lens, there is a lot to pick apart. But when I set that lens down and simply play through this section of the game, I can't help but find myself enjoying my time down here. The dungeon is essentially a series of disconnected areas, with the Construct Factory itself acting as the hub area, or essentially a central room. The 4 depots then act as side areas that contain our objectives, and the Spirit Temple serves as the boss arena. I've heard a lot of people complain that this place was underwhelming in a lot of ways, and that they didn't like how this dungeon was so weirdly segmented. But this really never bothered me. Truth is, the way this place is structured is very Zelda dungeon, just with some slices made. If you took all of these areas and connected them with hallways instead of open space, you would have what is 100% a core dungeon experience. The game just did away with the hallways and had the expansive depths traversable here instead. But really, if they had combined all of these segmented little areas into one building, I doubt we'd be hearing all of these complaints. That said, I adore the depths. I know, the environments are very samey, I know, there isn't a ton of variety, I know, the map design, I know. But there's just something about this place that I can't peel myself away from. The enveloping darkness, the bleak atmosphere, the strange, almost alien plant life, the real palpable sense of danger. It's all surreal and magical in a way that is just unlike anything else in the series. So, having the dungeons set down here with swaths of this area to explore is really something special. I love the atmosphere of this enormous area being so dark, with only the artificial lights of the factory and depots lighting the way. There are also 2 light routes nearby, which do help illuminate the area. But I think the atmosphere is just a little bit more interesting without that extra bit of visibility. Even still though, after activating those light routes, the insides of the depots still retain their ambience, and it's entirely up to you if you want to go lighting them up or not. So this is not a complaint, just me stating my preference. Speaking of atmosphere, I have to talk about the music here. First off, there's actually a dedicated piece of music for when Minoru asks you to begin constructing her body. It's this calm but inquisitive little piece that is really quite charming. The rest of the dungeon phases very much adhere to that idea of the track building upon itself. It starts out simple, hollow even, and adds more layers to the music as you make progress. The rest of the dungeons also change their music throughout, but they just as often pivot into almost entirely different songs. This dungeon's theme instead keeps the same core track and builds upon it piece by piece, mirroring the way that we are collecting the limbs of Minoru's construct body and assembling it piece by piece as well. the end, a track that began as hollow and ambient ends up being this deeply layered song, filled with a sense of longing and regret. The strings here convey such sadness. There are elements of the track that seem taken right from the usual Depths theme, which fits, while also incorporating instrumentation found in the Shrine theme. Between that and the way these bells, chimes, and strings tend to echo and reverberate, this dungeon's theme truly fits this setting of a long forgotten facility lost underground in the massive cavernous depths. I don't think I've had a single bad thing to say about any of the music in this game. The composers knocked it out of the park, really. But this one in particular is a favorite of mine. It is simply gorgeous. Actually playing through the dungeon is quite interesting, and in many ways it's almost the opposite experience of what we talked about in Hyrule Castle, which was a gauntlet-style dungeon focused almost entirely on combat. The Construct Factory, meanwhile, is very puzzle-focused. As already mentioned, we're tasked by Minoru at the start of the dungeon with gathering the pieces to build her a new body. The 4 pieces we need are found in the 4 respective depots surrounding the factory. In a way, this is a spin on the terminal structure that the 4 temples have used, but rather than just needing to go and push a button in several locations, each depot shuts us in and forces us to bring each construct piece forward through a new path, solving puzzles as we go. This has several effects. For one, it's far more interesting than just an arbitrary terminal. We have to engage more deeply with the puzzles that are here, and we're more invested in doing that because we have a far more tangible objective. These depots can be done in any order, and the puzzles themselves end up being well-crafted, multifaceted little challenges that more often than not can be completed in a variety of ways. And let's not forget about Ascend either, which has use cases for it built into nearly every room. Unlike the castle, where I complained about it, this dungeon truly feels like it was not just built with Link's new arsenal of abilities in mind, but it also feels like the only dungeon to wholly embrace them. The other dungeons either feel as though they didn't fully account for Link's new powers, actively designed around them being useful, or were designed in such a way that using them felt like breaking the game in a way. But here, they're vital to progression, and it is great. I've talked a lot about the cheese factor of this game in these videos, mostly because I'm examining things through the very narrow lens of the dungeons, but I'd like to mention that tying our progression to retrieving and bringing these physical objects like this pretty well negates that cheese factor. You can't rocket your way through or ascend out of rooms because you've got to take these items with you, and doing so is the puzzle. It also, in some ways, feels like there's a little flavor of each previous temple incorporated here. There's this room where we have to cross these lava pools like in the Fire Temple. This room has an electrified pillar representing the Lightning Temple. We've got fans and a whole challenge of using wings to fly the construct component to represent the Wind Temple. And this room has a pool of water that is almost entirely inconsequential to represent the way that water didn't matter at all in the Water Temple. Okay, I'm joking, there's a part where we can build a boat. Quips aside, having elements from each prior dungeon all worked into a final dungeon isn't new to Zelda. This has been done in Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, Skyward Sword, more recently the final trial in Breath of the Wild, and well, there are many other examples. But this place does this all while retaining its own identity and gameplay ideas. There's a room with lava, but you're not stepping into a clearly labeled Fire Temple room. It's It's just a room that incorporates those gameplay ideas of using a vehicle to get across the lava, but it's still distinctly a part of this dungeon. It combines those ideas that were introduced to us elsewhere with the design ideas that matter to progression here. I like that. That said, I've been painting with some pretty broad strokes so far, so let's take a look at things in a little more detail. The left leg depot feels like a pretty natural starting point for this dungeon, as the puzzles are a little more on the simple side. And there's a device dispenser here to stock up on useful items. First, we need to bring the leg up this elevator, then angle this broken bridge and use it as a ramp to launch the leg across the gap here, and then take it back to the assembly area. The left arm depot first features this functional door that acts as a hint for later, as well as a programming flex by the devs. We need to take the arm across first this lava pool, then through this section with 2 lava falls. Then use this wheel to open the door the same way as was teased to us before, and ride your way down this stream of water back to the assembly area. The right arm depot has upside down wheels acting like a conveyor belt that we can use to bring the arm upstairs. Then we can repurpose some of these wheels to get the arm across this electrified bridge. Don't worry too much about getting yourself across it though, since there's a ladder on the other side. Then we can build another vehicle if you'd like and drive the piece back to the factory. You just may get interrupted by a boss bokoblin and his entourage along the way. The right leg depot is the trickiest one to get to, so it's usually the one I save for last. The entrance is elevated and the way up is broken, so it takes a bit of work to get to, but nothing unmanageable. The main puzzle here is getting the arm up to this ledge, which there is a track you can use, but because of the poles attached to it, it ends up being easier to make good use of recall and ultra hand instead. Maybe there is some cheese here after all. Then we can bring it upstairs, use some wings, and bring it back to the assembly stage. Each of the depots has an optional treasure chest to find as well. So while the puzzles are rather linear, there's still incentive to be thorough and poke around. Once we've assembled Minoru's construct, it's off towards the Spirit Temple. There's a bit of a walk over there which serves as a tutorial for how to use our newly acquired companion and mech. There's a slew of monsters to battle along the way, including a Hinox, as well as Gloom to walk over, showing us that we're protected from Gloom damage. There's rocks to break and a variety of devices provided to us that we can attach to the construct for different uses. This hike from the factory through the depths and to the Spirit Temple does a great job of teaching us here. Really, it's a great way of getting us used to these new mechanics rather than just throwing us into the boss fight before we've had a chance to familiarize ourselves. I just have a few grievances. This isn't necessarily a level design complaint so much as it is a complaint with the mechanics, but those things are intertwined, so it's still worth mentioning. But if I'm being honest, I don't really like using Minoru's construct all that much outside of the boss fight, which we'll come back to in a moment. In a good majority of circumstances, I just don't find riding on the construct to be very fun. I think this comes down to the slow movement speed coupled with the constant battery drain. It makes sense that using the devices that are attached to the construct would drain your energy cells, just like any other vehicle. But the mere act of walking takes such a quick toll on your battery, but for some reason only when you're riding it. She can walk around no issue the rest of the time. Is Link just really heavy? This issue was exacerbated by the fact that during this playthrough, I've been rushing through this game to get footage far more than I usually would, and thus have not upgraded my battery at all. That's on me, I get that. But still, this thing being so lumbering and cumbersome, I find ends up doing more harm than good in combat. Like when I'm surrounded by Horriblins here, this fight ends up being no problem for me independently, but while using Mineru's construct, I just end up feeling held back by the slow attack speed and lack of dodging capabilities. Not to mention that the construct is so big that even when I'm not riding it, I find she just keeps getting in the way. I tend to have all of the sages disabled for exactly this reason. So that's not an issue exclusive to Mineru per se, but because of how intrinsically tied to the dungeon she is, because having her construct is mandatory during this part of the game, the issue really is hard to overlook here in particular. It's a little bit ironic that for a dungeon where the objective is to build a mech, which you would then pilot and use for the boss fight, the assembly is the part that I find the most fun, rather than the intended payoff of using the mech. But that's just me. Alright, with all of that said, once we've assembled the construct and battled our way through baddies and boulders alike, there's just one quick rocket jump to make to reach the Spirit Temple. And it's inside there that we'll find the dungeon boss. After a quick elevator ride, we'll find ourselves confronted by the seized construct. Visually speaking, this is a great boss design, a real nice foil to our own newly built ally. The body of the seized construct is actually one that Mineru herself built some time long ago. But it's not just being controlled by Ganondorf's evil energy, it's also corroded and worn down, with chunks of its chassis looking melted in much the same way as what we saw happen to our very own Master Sword. So even here, we have a bit of visual storytelling. There's a chance that before being seized, this construct put up a fight against its would-be captor, but ultimately lost and was taken over. Either way, the seized construct is a great counterpart to our own. And yeah, before I forget, the boss music here is pretty good. It's a perfectly serviceable boss fight theme, but it doesn't quite stand out to me in the same way that the other temple boss themes do. There's nothing wrong with the track per se, it totally does the job well. But compared to the likes of Queen Gibdo's theme or heck Colgera's theme, well, those tracks just set a very high bar, I guess. Again, not bad, just not as good as those other pieces of music. For all the grief I just gave using Mineru's construct, this may sound a bit contradictory. However, I find this boss fight to be very fun. Essentially, we're fighting an opponent with the same moves and combat capabilities as us, in what can and has been described as a rock'em sock'em robot fight, and it is a good time. The gist of the fight is that there is a perimeter of electrified barbed wire around the arena, and we want to knock our opponent back into it without suffering the same fate ourselves, almost like a sumo match. Along the way, there are some devices and tools that spawn around the room, which can greatly aid the battle. I'm particularly fond of using cannons here to keep some distance, but punching away with these spiked mace hands is pretty fun too. In many ways, this boss actually reminds me of the Koloktos battle from way back in Skyward Sword, which was my favorite boss in that game. In both cases, we have a multi-limbed automaton made from ancient technology that is corrupted by malice. In both cases, we must use our dungeon item, the whip and Mineru's construct respectively, to disarm our opponent and use what it drops against it. And most importantly, in both cases, the battle forgoes being mechanically complex or difficult in favor of being one that is just plain old fun. It's cathartic to just wail on this guy and beat him up in much the same way as it's fun to rip Koloktos apart limb from limb and then wail on him. I talk a lot about mechanics and design, and these things are all important, but the most important factor is the game being fun, and that is achieved here. It helps that, unlike other enemies that were originally designed to be fought by Link, the seized construct was absolutely designed with Mineru's inherent strengths and weaknesses in mind. Mineru's construct being slow and lumbering with delayed heavy swings for attacks isn't so much of an issue when your opponent is just as slow and lumbering. There is a second phase to the battle as well, in which the difficulty is heightened as the seized construct grows more limbs, but mechanically speaking, the battle plays out as more of the same, just with an added bit of challenge. Once we've knocked back and electrified him enough times, he'll, explode. As one does, the gloom will dissipate, we'll get our heart container as usual, and we can collect Mineru's secret stone. Then it's more exposition, and we're off. So that's the dungeon. Overall, I feel the Construct Factory and Spirit Temple get something of a bad rap, and while this may not apply to everyone, I feel that for many, that bad reputation may stem from viewing these scenarios in isolation, rather than viewing them as components that make up a larger dungeon experience. Of course, the Spirit Temple will be underwhelming if you only consider this elevator and boss arena as the dungeon, but since we don't have a dedicated dungeon map this time from which to derive hard dungeon boundaries, I'm inclined to look at the gameplay structure and base my interpretation of the dungeon off of that, as being these three acts combined into one scenario: building the construct, bringing the construct, and battling with the construct. That's what makes the most sense to me. When viewed this way, the Construct Factory and Spirit Temple combined excel as a dungeon experience. In fact, it's this exact structure that a lot of classic dungeons use. If you've seen my A Link to the Past dungeon videos, then you know what I'm talking about. First, a large open explorable space that culminates in getting the dungeon item, then a linear gauntlet of challenges where we use that item leading up to the boss fight. Yeah, this place uses the A Link to the Past dungeon formula, as mentioned earlier in the video. If you took all of these isolated areas and slapped a series of closed-off hallways between them to connect them all with hard boundaries, I doubt we'd be hearing a lot of the same complaints about it. But the trade-off would be that it would undercut some of the other aspects that work so well here. It's fun to pilot these vehicles back to the factory from the various depots. The atmosphere being in the depths works so well here anyways, so frankly, I'm inclined to say that those added hallways wouldn't really be necessary. Would they add anything of value? If we weren't shut into the depots, I would say yes. But since we are, and we're forced to engage with these puzzles before heading into the larger open space, it ends up not being an issue for me. But of course, actually piloting Mineru's construct is something I don't find to be particularly enjoyable outside of that boss fight. And that is the biggest thing that holds this dungeon back from being excellent. That is partially on me for my lack of battery upgrades on this particular save file, but it is just as much on the game for making it a slow and clunky experience, and generally less enjoyable than it is to just be Link, who is himself incredibly nimble and mobile in this game. So overall, this dungeon lands somewhere above average for me. The Lightning Temple is still my favorite, of course, but the Construct Factory and Spirit Temple still nails so many things with its excellent atmosphere and puzzles. But there's one more thing to talk about before we wrap up this video. While I don't consider this to be a dungeon, much the same way as I don't consider the moon in Majora's Mask to be a dungeon, it is still very much worth talking about the Forgotten Foundation, Gloom's approach, origin, and lair, as well as the game's final boss and ending. So, final spoiler warning, here we go. This final section of the game is awesome. Level design-wise, there isn't too much to discuss. There are no branching paths, no puzzles to complete, none of that. This is a straight, linear shot of halls and rooms leading towards the boss. However, that does not make it any less incredible of an experience. First of all, the atmosphere. We're once again descending into the depths, but rather than the almost tranquil and calm atmosphere found at the Construct Factory, this is the depths at its most dangerous. There is gloom everywhere. It is dark and all of the game's toughest enemies are ready and waiting for you. As you descend down this chasm and down into the Forgotten Foundation below the castle, things start feeling more and more claustrophobic, more bleak, desperate, and dangerous. Not even the power of the sages can reach you down here. The music pulses and builds and swells, and it just keeps going. I love this entire section so much, this tension, this real test of your resilience and endurance. Eventually, we'll return to where it all started. This broken bridge leads us to the very room where our adventure began. Then, the same mural room, where we can now uncover those final sections of mural and see how Zelda's fate was set in stone all along. We find the imprisoning chamber, and just like we did back on the Great Sky Islands, we jump. But this time, not into the freedom of the open-air Great Sky Islands, this time into the unknown and deepest parts of the depths. The source from where all these gloom roots spread. A lone torch on the ground reminds us of why we are here. And with this new resolve, we can confront the Demon King's army. This is essentially a horde battle, but the sages will intervene and fight alongside us now. Not their avatars, the sages for real. After making quick work of the army, the bosses we fought across the previous temples will spawn in, with the sages holding them off so that Link alone can confront Ganondorf. Ganondorf in his full glory. A one-on-one duel, me versus the G-Man, just like how it used to be. Ganondorf is actually finally a very challenging boss. He fights in much the same way as Phantom Ganon, but he hits harder, he moves faster, and his gloom damage cannot be reversed. This fight has multiple phases too, with Ganondorf powering up using his secret stone, multiplying himself like Phantom Ganon did. The sages will show up to help us here once again, and pulling off moves that his Phantom never could. Ganondorf flurry rushes you. He flurry rushes you. This battle has a real push and pull to it, and it is, and I don't say this lightly, my favorite fight against Ganondorf in the series. It is exhilarating. After one hell of a battle, unable to accept defeat, he does something I never anticipated. Ganondorf will follow Zelda's example and swallow his secret stone, transforming himself into the demon dragon. Fleeing to the sky with Link in his grasp, it almost seems as though he won, even if through desperate means. But then, the light dragon, Zelda herself, as though acting through instinct alone, will come to our aid. Together, we will be able to triumph. With Zelda lifting us to a great vantage point, we can skydive down to the demon dragon and strike at his weak points. This portion of the battle is not difficult, but I stand by this choice. This is everything that the Dark Beast Ganon fight from Breath of the Wild should have been. After a genuine, challenging battle, we earned this final phase, which is all about catharsis, tension, and now release. Spectacle. This is perfect. With the newly revitalized Master Sword, imbued with sacred power, we can strike at and shatter that stolen secret stone and end the Demon King. But there is one more thing to do. By force of what is admittedly Deus Ex Machina, Zelda is restored to her former self. And we finally, after hours of adventuring, battling hordes of monsters, solving devious puzzles and avoiding traps, after everything, we can do what we failed to do at the start of the game. Catch Zelda. Is this the perfect ending? Well, no. Rauru and Sonya magically showing up to reverse the draconification process simply shouldn't happen the way that it does. As it so happens, while this script was in the works, fellow Zelda creator Draken made this video talking about just that subject. And it is well worth the watch. There's a link in the description. But for me, this whole experience feels earned in a way. This genuine challenge with this lengthy, tension-building gauntlet, which ends in the most difficult Ganondorf has ever been to take on, with this brilliant and cinematic spectacle of a finale, this nuclear explosion. It just hits all the right notes for me. Tension and release. As far as finales go, this is one of the best in the series, and I genuinely mean that. This game has absolutely captivated me since its release back in May, and I don't see that letting up anytime soon. But as far as producing dungeon-related videos go, well, this is a wrap on Tears of the Kingdom. This game means a lot to me, and while it has some low points, like that water temple, it also has, for me, some of the series' greatest strengths and innovations. I love this game to bits, and I genuinely can't wait to see where they could possibly go from here. So, that's it everyone. Next up will be a return to the 2D side of Zelda with a close look at the dungeon design of Link's Awakening. But until then, thank you for watching. And special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon. You guys make this all possible. Thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, Bunny, Stefan, as well as all of the folks whose names you're seeing on screen right now. You guys are awesome. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.